This might take a while. This could take some time. Chipping at the top as well. And the sides. Oh, it's starting to crack everywhere. Ooh. It's perspiring. Oh!
Hey Internet, welcome to Worldview Everlasting, your favorite YouTube addiction.
This episode of Worldview Everlasting is brought to you by the letter Awesome, the numbers Sweet Action, and Issues Etc. Talk radio for the thinking Christian. IssuesETC.org.
Oh my god! Wow! Oh, that's incredible!
This week's gospel reading is from Mark chapter 7, verses 31 to 37, and then maybe you can also include verses 24 to 30. So basically two stories that come out of where we've been in this one story the last week or so, where Jesus is in this debate with the Pharisees over the traditions of the elders, not over against the idea of tradition, but over against the idea of putting tradition over and above the Word of God. And you might recall from a couple weeks back, there's this really cool twist you could put into this week's text if you want to by going back to where Jesus is quoting Isaiah the prophet when he says that this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Where you can track where that is in Isaiah down, and you can see that the response God's going to take to his complaint of this about Old Testament Israel is he's going to do a couple of things, including heal the deaf and turn Lebanon, which is that land of the Philistines, into a fruitful field. And see, that land of the Philistines is the place called Syro-Phoenicia in the present day. So that when Jesus goes on from his little debate with the Pharisees and in fact heals a demon-possessed girl of the Syro-Phoenicians, of the Philistines in Lebanon. She's still in Lebanon. Her mother's with Jesus, but she's in Lebanon. And then turns around and heals a deaf mute guy. Well, heck, this is like hard to not see as some rather profound fulfillment of prophecy. On top of that, again, it's kind of hard to pass over this whole in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men thing, because in our current climate as American Christians, it's almost as if we read that text to say, in vain do they worship me, teaching doctrines, bad doctrines. What we really need is love and tolerance and happiness and acceptance. Isn't Jesus just a welcoming guy and pulls everybody nice and hugs them close? That's what we need, more of that, and not any of this doctrine, which is like evil by nature because it's called doctrine, and doctrine's a bad word or something. But see, that's not what really is going on. What's going on is that they're teaching as doctrines things that aren't. That is, as eternal truths, things that aren't. So when we kind of run around teaching that we shouldn't worry about doctrine, but we should all just love each other, guess what we're doing? We're teaching as doctrines the tradition of men. Yeah. Ouch. As opposed to what Jesus really wants, which is the pure preaching of his word, both law and gospel. Call it doctrine. Okay, fine. It means it's teaching that lasts forever. Both what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, the resulting fact of that shows that we are evil to the core, and the resulting action that he takes, which is doctrine, which is that he goes and he fixes it. He goes and he heals it. He casts out the demon. He heals the blind and the mute. He walks to the cross where he dies for the sins of the world. You want to worship God? Hear and believe those words. That's what worship of him is all about. It doesn't matter what you give to him. You can't give to him anything he hasn't given to you. What matters is what you need him to give you, which is a righteousness not your own, a righteousness that only comes from God, imputed into you, earned by Jesus and his atoning sacrifice on the cross. Yo. So, Moving forward then, you have these two stories, and I'm going to skip over the Syro-Phoenician woman. You can use her if you want. I kind of gave you that hat tip there already about how to pull her out of Isaiah, talking about, say, the Philistines and stuff, and there's this whole little, should not take the bread of the children and throw it to the dogs thing, and so everyone freaks out, oh my gosh, how does he call this woman a dog? And then everyone else freaks out and says, oh, he doesn't really call her a dog, it's just a metaphor. Well, kind of maybe, but just think about this one too. So she's Syro-Phoenician from the land of the Philistines. I mean, what is this kind of Old Testament phrase? I think David says it at one point to Goliath, you uncircumcised dog? Yeah. It's not just about being a Gentile, it's about being uncircumcised, which is to be outside of the community of holiness, which is to be outside of the pure doctrine preaching that God gives. It is not good to throw to the unbelievers the things which are given for the sake of the believers. Now, what the woman then shows in her response is, hey buddy, I'm a believer. And it's this little people of yours who have their little traditions that they've held up to like keep out the world, which are the problem. And so, yeah, would you please just kind of let me eat the crumbs that fall from their table, since they don't want to hear you or receive you. Hey, hello, I'll take your grace. Yeah, that's what happens. Zooming in a little closer then on verses 31 to 37, he returns to the region of Tyre and Sidon near the Sea of Galilee in an area called the Decapolis, which means the 10 cities. And this is an area of 10 cities. On the southeastern side of the Sea of Galilee, kind of bordering towards that desert region and not really quite down to Samaria. And this Decapolis itself kind of functioned like a federation, a small state. They were certainly under the Roman Empire, but they were controlled by or from within as a group that like bound themselves together to protect each other and to try to prosper. Maybe the most famous city in their midst was Damascus. That's where Paul was going when he got knocked off his horse. Also Gadara, where the Gerasenes lived, this guy named Legion who like lived in caves and stuff, yeah? And all the pigs that were driven into the sea by the demons that came out of him, he was a Gerasene. And also not in the New Testament, but Pella, which is a city in the valley of the Jordan, to which the Christians withdrew and fled during the first siege of Jerusalem by Rome, leading up to and around 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. Interestingly enough, just as they had been warned to do by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24. Anyhow, so this is the region that they're in, and I'm not exactly sure that I know why exactly this is important, but they're coming back down out of the north into the south, and as they're doing this, who's they? I don't know, the crowds, the people that live there, they bring to Jesus a deaf man who has a speech impediment, magelalas. It can also mean mute, and I'm kind of inclined to think that myself, but more modern scholars tend to believe it's more like a speech impediment, so there was something that made it almost impossible to understand what he was saying, but his vocal cords were working. It had more to do with something in his tongue that was the problem. And maybe that does make sense given what's going to happen next. So they bring this guy to Jesus and they beg him to lay his hands on him. And even though apparently he's not a Jew either, there's none of this, you dogs thing going on. He just simply sees and responds. Because, well, there's something else going on here as far as the thrust of the text, right? Throughout Mark, we've seen miracle after miracle after miracle. And part of what's going on is we're just supposed to be amazed at the authority of Jesus, his singularity, as it were, his ability to command just about anything that exists, his lordship over creation. But we're also starting to see twists to each of these stories where the emphasis is no longer on the miracle itself, although that's still there, but on some other thing. In the previous case, it was this gift of faith to the Gentiles. In this account, it's going to be something else, which is at the end. So he takes the man aside privately, and he puts his fingers into his ears, and then he spits on his hand and touches the man's tongue. Ew. And looking up into heaven, he sighed, which is kind of interesting too, and then he says to the man, Ephphatha, which is not Greek, but Aramaic, and means in Greek, dianoichthete, which means in English, be opened. And both of his ears were open, and he began to talk plainly. Now there's more that's going to happen in a second, but there's a couple of kind of key questions that should arise from what we just saw. Why does he stick his fingers in his ears and spit and put his hand on the guy's tongue? Why not just do as he's done so many times before and just say with the word, this is the case? Why not smack him in the forehead Benny Hinn style like he didn't exactly do with the leper, but he at least touched the leper before he healed the leper? What is this about? But this is another one of these kind of wiggy little things you find going on in Mark. Jesus almost never does the same miracle the same way twice, place. And then on top of that, regularly he makes use of the material world in his doing of miracles. So whereas in our minds we normally would just think of miracles as something like superpowers where you're just like kazam and you like do your healing thing, in Mark, Jesus is constantly making use of like physical stuff in and around that healing. This is going to happen again in a couple of chapters when he heals a blind man by putting a mud pack on his face. Not a mud pack, he spits in the guy's face. And at first it doesn't really work out. He actually looks around and he thinks everyone looks like trees, and goodness knows how a blind man knows what a tree looks like, but he thinks everyone looks like trees, and then Jesus fixes that and it actually works out. And that's got its own kind of point with it too. So again, what's going on? And I'm inclined to kind of join with those scholars who think what's going on is Jesus is showing that his word often will attach itself to a visible physical thing in order to do its work. Even though his word can just do the work in and of itself, he has, for the sake of the creatures who are material, attached his word to material things in order to make a more perfect miracle, as it were. So for example, going way back, the snake on the pole, the Israelites have been bitten by a bunch of poisonous snakes and they're asking for help, and rather than God just saying, Moses, say they're healed and they will be, he says, Moses, put up a snake on a pole and if they look on it, they will be. And so through this medium, this means, this material thing, the word becomes sacramental, becomes mysterious, and does what it promises, but only while attached to that physical thing. So this also is happening here where physically he is making his word to place itself in a particular thing. The word is not universal. Be opened is not spoken to the entire world around him, but to these particular places where the physical contact is made. And so, not that it is a sacrament, but like unto the sacraments, the grace is given in a particular location attached to a particular thing. In this case, fingers in ears, spittle, and fingers on tongue. Yeah? In the case of baptism and the supper, same kind of thing. I baptize you in the name of Father, Son, and Spirit is not a word to the world. It's a word to those who are washed with the water and that word in one place. Take and eat, not any bread, but this bread. Take and drink, not any wine, but this cup. These things are the grace of God coming to you as promises for your salvation. So I'm kind of inclined to think that's sort of what's going on here. Not that this is sacramental, but this is showing that sacramentally is how God works. Yeah? I don't know. You can take or leave that one as you will. Otherwise, it's like, well, what is he doing? You know, you got to come up with another explanation. But then what's really crazy is after this, Jesus charges all those who have seen this not to tell anyone. And this is not the first time he's done this. This is this whole secrecy thing in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus is constantly telling people not to tell people about who he is or what he's done. It's like the anti-mission Jesus, and you can throw the Great Commission out there all you want, but you still got to make sense of this. What does it mean? Why is Jesus telling people not to tell people? And in Mark's Gospel, and depending on how you understand the way the book ends, nobody tells anybody. I mean, the angel does say to the women, go and tell the apostles that he's risen, but then they don't do it. They run away afraid and nothing happens. Dark, scary ending. Right? But then this is also kind of the point. The more that Jesus tells people not to tell people, the more they tell people. God works in mysterious ways. Whereas we think the law is what actually is going to make people be good and make people want to be Christians and maybe even make people do mission, the law doesn't have that effect. The law only brings about sin and more sin. Law, which is good, was given to the sinful in order to make them utterly sinful, as St. Paul says. Yet, what happens with the gospel? The gospel can't be contained. The faith which believes in who Jesus is and what he's done because it hears his word preached and puts its trust into that truth, it can't be restrained. You can try to bottle it up all you want, it just explodes forth and does even more. Which is why, if the church really does want more mission to happen in this world, then we need more preaching of Jesus' gospel. Less, go do this, people, and more, here's what Jesus has done, people. Pretty sweet stuff, huh? And you could even begin to say, and don't tell anybody. And guess what? They'd break that rule and they'd go speak, make the good confession before men. It's totally backwards from the way we think. We think that we need more law. Do this, and it'll get done. It's not the way it works. The more we say do this, the more is never done. But when God comes and says, I have done it, behold, suddenly faith comes alive, and the result is more love bursts forth than you would have gotten from the law in the first place. I know it doesn't make sense, it doesn't fit, it doesn't jive, but it's true. Why? Because God says so. And you see a hint of it here. It's not like written out in stone, but you got a hint of it here in the fact that Jesus is telling people, tell no one, and the more he says tell no one, the more the gospel that they've seen bursts forth anyway and says, hey, you got to check out this guy. We don't know who he is yet. We haven't quite figured out he's the Son of God yet, but he's like healing everybody, and it's pretty darn cool. It seems as if the reign of God has come into our midst. And so all the people around were astonished beyond measure, saying of Jesus, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak, which again brings to close this concept of Isaiah that was open when Jesus said, in vain do they worship me, teaching the traditions of men as if they were my word. But now people are in fact responding to his word because they're seeing that his word is more powerful than the words of men. It actually does what it says. Good news being he's going to the cross to do what God has said must be done for you, that is, die for your sins and the sins of the world. More on that, of course, every time you hear good preaching anywhere. So I think you're good to go. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you next time.